Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Emily Sikorski. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Communication for TTI Success Insights. And today we are all gathered, thank you for joining us, to discuss 3 signs that your assessment may not be as valid as you think. Our presenter today is going to be Bill J. Bonnstetter. He is the Chairman and Founder of TTI Success Insights and Target Training International. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. This is a 45-minute call. We hope to kind of go through these slides and then have some time for questions at the end. Feel free to type your questions into that chat or questions tab on your GoToMeeting panel. We also are live tweeting the event, and a great way to kind of take notes is to live tweet along with us. We use the hashtag TTISIChat. To tag those tweets. A little bit about TTISI. We believe that all people have unique talents and skills of which they're often unaware. So we exist to reveal and harness those talents and skills using what we call the science of self. The science of self is really 30 years of human behavioral research and brain research that has shown us inside of a person, what makes them do the things they do, why they do the things they do, the motivators behind it. We look into EQ, we look into stress quotient, and we provide our assessments to a global network of distributors that use them to hire, attract, retain talent all over the world. Our assessments are at use across the Fortune 500 and are based on our research. And that's really what our topic is today. So without any further ado, I will introduce and pass it on to Bill to get us started.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here, and I'm happy to discuss this particular topic. For the last 30 plus years, I've really been involved in helping people be all they can be. And one of the most important things to achieve that is to give them really good, accurate information that is totally personalized for them. And, today with the internet, I see new assessments coming on the market, and it seems like they're making claims before the ink is dry on their assessment.
Yes.
About how valid they are, and I don't see any research. So I really felt we really should be talking about this, and I'm trying to raise the bar of the assessment industry. If we want to make claims, they really need to be supported with scientific research and evidence.
Absolutely.
But I see so many people just making total claims on their website that is not supported with any of this. So, I've run into things where people were saying they're approved by EEOC. EEOC does not approve people. Mm-hmm. They go after people if they find a violation, sure. But there's nothing in their makeup that says they approve anything. Mm-hmm. And the other day I thought it was funny, I had a legal opinion from their company attorney that the assessment did not discriminate. Mm-hmm. I thought, wow, a legal opinion. If legal opinions were all that great, we wouldn't even have cases, would we? The attorneys would tell us true. Exactly what to do. So anyway, let's jump right in here and talk about some of the first sign is that their claims are not really supported by scientific evidence. We got the in-house statistician. Okay. Yes. If you use an in-house statistician, just be honest and say that. If you use an out-of-house, use that. But we have people making claims without identifying whether it's in-house or out-of-house. So you basically have to assume that it's probably in-house. We have people making claims of validity and reliability, and they put up no Cronbach alpha scores to actually demonstrate exactly where they are. So we're looking for construct validity. And then I like to look at all the new assessments that are coming out. I actually look at the questionnaire itself. And then I look at the report. Are they asking the same questions that they're reporting on? Okay. In many cases, I find that, they're asking questions and reporting on things that is not being collected in this. Now, maybe not everybody can do what I do, but I've been doing this for 30 plus years. And last year, I looked at over 30 million decisions made by people worldwide and was drawing conclusions about their culture and the differences of various countries. So I try to really speak from a background of not only caring, but we have the scientific evidence for that. And anybody that wants to come to my office, I'd be happy to pull out the spreadsheets. We got tons of spreadsheets around here with all of the data that we look at. And, research is a lot of fun, especially if you go into it not knowing anything and saying, let the numbers talk to us. Let them tell us about it. So we always want to look for on their website and in their sales pitch, any claims that are not being supported by scientific evidence. And to me, scientific evidence would be an absolute research project with numbers, correlations, and et cetera, that was explaining what they're talking about rather than just saying we're the best.
Okay, got it.
The second sign, I think you should question your assessment if they have no peer-reviewed articles. Now, years ago, we didn't have peer-reviewed articles either, but we didn't say we had them. Mm-hmm. We didn't make claims we didn't have. Today, we work long and hard to write papers that are peer-reviewed and put in articles in magazines. Now, if you've never done this before, it's quite a process, and it's not a fun process.
No.
Because it takes 6 months. Sometimes it takes that long to get approved, and then it could take another 3-4 months before it actually be printed.
I think it's important to mention here too, Bill, that through that review process, we are being challenged on certain claims. We have to respond to them. So there is a vetting that goes on. There's a critical analysis from these outside parties, and that's part of what is important to prove our validity.
Yeah, I remember here on the article that was printed in Mind and Body, we had one reviewer send 11-page notes of it, and they were not all negative. Many of them were positive.
Right.
And they printed that article. It was 28 pages single-spaced when we sent it in. Mm-hmm. But again, it was looking at decision-making and tracking that. But the research, I could write a white paper and we could publish that tomorrow and post it tomorrow. And I think that's good. But if you don't have any peer reviewed, it doesn't mean that you really have the protocol, because many of our white papers that we've done in the past did not have the scientific protocol to become a peer reviewed article.
Right.
Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that we couldn't do that, but when you have solid research, you really need to even put that into your white paper to validate exactly what it is you're bringing to the party. So I always look to see what magazines are they getting published in, and are they being published in magazines, or are they living vicariously through other assessment providers out there? And I have people quite often, refer to us and say, well, TTI can do it, so can we. That isn't.
Go for it. Right. Give it a go. So what about our third sign here?
Well, the third sign is making claims that they can solve all of your problems with one assessment.
Yeah,
this one probably bugs me more than anything else, because we as people are very complex. And the most popular assessment in the whole world is a behavioral assessment. And it does do a great job of identifying how you do what you do. It doesn't tell you why you do it. It doesn't tell me what you can do. It doesn't tell me anything about your intelligence, your emotional intelligence, how you deal with stress, any of those things. There's nothing in there about experience or education. And yet we have people using this one assessment and trying to solve all people problems. And it's totally unfair. So, to validate what I'm talking about, I had an outside statistician do a research project for me using multiple assessments. I handed them 178 serial entrepreneurs. And then we also gave them 178 people drawn from random, or people in the United States workforce. And I didn't tell them who was who. And I said, I want you to be able to separate these into the correct group. And I gave them 3 assessments. We had behavior, we had motivators, and we had skills. He ran behavioral assessments and came back and said 60% of the time I could predict the serial entrepreneurs, but only 60% of the time, 40% of the time I was wrong. Now, that percentage of 60% is probably better than just interviewing people alone with no assessment.
Yeah, I've read like 40 to 50% with no assessment.
Oh,
it's like either
flip a coin.
Right, exactly.
So it's slightly better than flipping a coin, but that's not what we're looking for, because we want to be more predictive than that. So he came back and he said if we use both behavior and motivators, it jumped to 84, 85% of the time I could put the serial entrepreneurs into their own group. That's still not good enough for our customers. And then he looked at using behavior, motivators, and the skills, and it jumped over 90% of the time he could put them into the correct category. Now, that's starting giving some predictive validity. But I got to share another story with you. We have a major utility company right here in the Valley, SRP happens to be their name. And they had a group of people that had taken our assessments that had preventable accidents. And they also had a group of people that had never had an accident. And they gave us those. And I looked at them. I looked at the graphs. I looked at every which way. And I said, I can't see the difference. So I handed it off to our statistician and said, I want to be able to separate these people based on this. And the good news was we were able to come up with a formula that identified 81% of the time we could predict people who would have a preventable accident. Now think about that.
Very powerful.
This is people just walking up and down the street. 81% of the time we could put them into the right category and identified them. We had SRP in here in the very room I'm in today, and we shared that information with them. It was not a sales pitch. Well, I don't like to work with companies on the sales pitch. I like to work with companies of saying, let's look at the data. Right. What is the data telling us? How can we use this data to get better?
Right.
How can we use this data to actually identify and prevent accidents?
Right, create a safer work environment.
Yes, and so we're continuing to work with that. But that's, again, we had to use multiple assessments to get at that. And the statistician said he had to run it 13 different times before he found a formula that actually worked and started being predictable. So we need this. The other thing I'll mention, again, hiring the whole person. Right. This is so critical. And if you were to tell me that I could only use one assessment, I really would have difficulty helping you in selection, because I just don't believe one assessment will treat people correctly. All right. So if I'm going to use assessments, I'm going to recommend a minimum of 3, and depending on the salary, I might go as high as 4 if you want that. Now, I'm still not through talking about predictive validity, because predictive validity can only be done at a business with a very certain job. We can't run predictive validity and tell you what is going to happen to a class of people. Because every time we put them into a company, you got a different culture, you got a different life cycle of the products, their services. You may have tangible, intangible work. You got all of these things going on. And so there's never 2 identical positions. So everybody has to do their own. And I'll tell you one more research project we did along this line. We actually, for 6 months, assessed all of the people that one company was interviewing and hiring. We assessed 100% of them. We controlled all the assessments. We did not give them a bit of information. At the end of 6 months, we actually ran all of their candidates through a screening process and eliminated a bunch of them and said we would not even have interviewed them because they didn't match the job. We sent the list of people to them that they would not interview. They came back with an email and said we would have eliminated 97% of all of our bad hires if we would have used your screening process. Now, let me point out, it is easier for me to eliminate a bad hire than it is to give you a guaranteed superior performer. Okay? Now, that's reality. That's dealing with people, and that's because it is so strong here when we have a total mismatch.
Yes.
So people say to me, what assessment should I use? And my answer is always the same. What do we need?
Right.
What is the problem? What is the issue that we have in front of us? And, if one tool always did the work, then I don't know why the doctors don't just use a thermometer.
Right, or just one Band-Aid.
One Band-Aid that was, and then really times what I see people doing is Band-Aid surgery.
Right.
And again, this whole assessment industry gets a bad reputation based on people out there that are saying and doing things that shouldn't be done. So I hope that this third sign here that you need to really check out your assessment companies if they're trying to solve all of those.
Right. So now we kind of gone through those 3 signs. We want to move into the key questions to ask for people if they are trying to find an assessment provider. So Bill, what are some things that our audience can ask their potential assessment provider?
Well, I go to websites and quite often people call me or send me an email and ask me if I've ever seen such and such
Sure.
assessment.
Right.
Just to remind me and get current, I search the web and I go to their website.
Of course.
And it's amazing how many people have assessments that there is absolutely no theory behind their assessments. In other words,
Scary.
I think they just went out, maybe they dreamed it up. All of these things came clear to them in a vision because they built their whole assessment. And, if you were here today with me, I would just pull out some of these assessments and show you how people are trying to measure things and then reporting on something totally different. It doesn't take a scientist to really see how bad some of these are. But I think, again, it's integrity. If you're a 4-quadrant system, DISC, Marston was the grandfather of that, and Marston book, if you haven't read it, we've got copies of it. We reprinted it because we believe so strongly in it. But I'll tell you, it's one of the hardest reads you'll ever have.
Sure.
Spranger, types of men. Our motivators is based on Spranger. Spranger talked about 6. There's a number of assessments out there claiming 7. What they've really done is sort of split a couple of the 6 into others, but they're losing the foundation.
Right.
And they need to go back and have some substance. So anyway, the Hartman is another one. There's plenty of theory behind these things. And then when we take the theory, the neat thing on all 3 of these, Marston, Spranger, and Hartman, they were all really forward thinkers. They were so far ahead of their time, they did not have the computers and the statistical analysis that we have today. And I would just love to be able to sit down with all 3 of them and tell them how good they were. Because the numbers have come back to prove it. But we're proud to say that there is a foundation behind our assessments. And when people are coming along selling something and there's no theory on it. Now, we have a skill assessment, and I'll be honest with you, the assessment is based on my analyzing the marketplace and looking at jobs and defining skills that are job related. I limited things like humor because that's, unless you're a comedian, that's probably not
a job requirement.
Not a job requirement, but we really went in and we looked at all of the skills that people were talking about, and we didn't invent skills. We didn't invent competencies. We didn't invent soft skills. What we did was define them. Once we define them, we can measure them.
Gotcha.
But if you can't define it, how do you measure it? And that's my point on this having some type of theory behind this.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Next question to ask.
Yeah, how is it validated? The Crumbach Alpha. When I was looking at the 30 plus million decisions, I found some things about Crumbach Alpha that not everybody knows. A bad question can be reliable. It's reliably bad.
Right.
A good question can also be reliable. Reliability is based on the number of questions. The more questions you ask, the more reliable it is. Now, this is sort of a catch-22 in the assessment industry because some cases we can actually be more right on with fewer questions.
Mm-hmm.
And as you add more and more questions, you're somewhat diluting your view of what you're trying to measure. But Cronbach alpha is out there. When I first got in the industry 30 plus years ago, a 0.6 was the minimum standard. Today it's at 0.7. And I've got one assessment in experimenting right now that I've got at 0.9.
Right.
Okay, we've got a lot of them in the 0.8s. And if you're not seeing, if they're saying they're valid and reliable, but they don't show you any scores, you should question and ask for a report of that. The other thing I look at is sample size. You know, back 30 years ago, most clinical assessments were normed on less than 100 people.
Wow.
That's 30 years ago.
Wow.
You know, the Minnesota multiphasic was slightly over 100.
Hmm.
So I look at the sample size, and if somebody is norming their assessment on 100 or 200 or even 300 people, I question it, because when you're breaking them down into the various categories, you're not getting very many people in each category. And how can you be reliable unless you have enough people? So I look for a typical sample. We wouldn't even consider anything under about 1,200, 1,500 for something we'd publish. We may run a pilot with a couple of hundred just to see how it's looking. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I look for is the date. The other day I was reading something of somebody that it was 2005 was the last time they printed up their validity study. I'm thinking, you need to realize that we as a population, as people, questions go south, words go out. 30 years ago, we used the word gay in the behavioral assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That word, the total context of gay has totally changed. Mm-hmm. Devout was another word. I removed these 30 years ago. Okay, so I removed some a year ago. Sure. Because again, ongoing research indicates that you really have to be on top of this. And as our population changes, so does their interpretation of those words. Let's show you an example of what I'm talking about. This is one of our latest papers that we just released showing the Cronbach alpha on our US DISC, 0.88 for the D, 0.89 for the I, 0.84 on the S, 0.86 on the C.
Wow.
If we were engineers building a robot, you'd want some 0.9s. But dealing with people, you know, if you had a correlation of 1.0, that's perfect. Okay. 0.9 is close to perfect. 0.8 is about as close, 0.889. This is about as close to 0.9 as you can get. And statisticians usually get excited anything above a 0.3.
Wow.
Is starting to say there is a correlation there.
Right.
And below that, we've got our correlations on our 6 motivators. Now, when I was doing the research in the various countries on this, what I discovered is that we had some bad Cronbachs, and I found we had bad translations. So until we started running Cronbachs in every country, we couldn't identify a bad translation. And let me just share with you why. We sent it out, we had it translated, we didn't have a clue what was coming back, whether it was a good translation or a bad translation. All we knew was that it was translated by a professional translator, and we were paying for that. But we discovered that, and then also in the process of that, we discovered some countries are unique. And it was a good translation, but some uniqueness. But all of the bad translations really were outliers, and I was able to identify. And when we do a Cronbach, I actually look at every line in the questionnaire. I'm not looking at the totals. This is the total for D's, but I look at every D thing to find out, are there D statements that D's don't pick, describing themselves? I'm sorry to say I found that in some of the past. And what bothers me is that some of our competitors out there are using some of the words I eliminated years ago. And so I know they haven't done their homework.
Right. All right, what about the next question here?
Yeah, again, validation studies on each. We found a need to norm in all the countries. In fact, if you're using a US norm throughout the world, you're actually punishing people in certain countries. Okay? There are cultural differences.
Yes.
The translation errors, but the cultural differences, and I can tell you right now, Russia and China are two ends of the spectrum with regard to Ds.
Mm-hmm.
Russia has a lot more Ds than most countries,
Mm-hmm.
and China has fewer Ds than most countries.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So if you go to China with a US norm, you're hurting the Chinese people. You're saying everybody should be eating corn, steak, and apple pie, right? And playing baseball. I mean, we can't apply US standards throughout
Right.
the world. And I've been around for a while, and when the Vietnamese came over, we taught them English as a second language, not English as their first language. Think about the power of that. We let the Vietnamese keep their culture. We didn't try to Americanize everybody that came into America. Prior to the Korean War and stuff, that was our goal.
Right.
We were sending tractors and seed corn around the world saying, you need to eat sweet corn and steak and you'll enjoy life and live to be long.
Mm-hmm.
So we've learned a lot about this, and it's really fun to do this research. Plus, it's even more fun to share it with the countries, because that's where I get the validation, is when I go to the countries and say, here's what I'm seeing about your country. Give me feedback. Am I seeing it right? What makes you unique?
And we sort of, on the next question, we just kind of covered that. Is there one norm for the world? Do you have norms based on the country's culture?
Yeah, more and more companies are using assessments for selection, and this is critical.
And especially in the global market.
Yeah, in the global market. So you may have a company, and TTI, we actually have different norms for our various languages.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them we're continually working on. It's very difficult for us to apply U.S. standards and even doing research in foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
Because I sent out a need. I want all college freshmen taking a general education course in the various countries. Well, you can't get that.
Right.
These people, many foreign countries, by age 12, have already been put into some type of vocation school, a different track. So we don't have a random sample that we can pull to gather the norms from. So it is expensive. And again, this is why some of these new assessment companies are coming out. They don't have the money or the time or the ability.
Right. They're not going to overcome those challenges to conduct the research that they should, particularly in foreign countries. So last question, that you can ask your potential assessment provider, do they have scientific evidence that their assessment does not discriminate?
Yeah, no, the only way I'm knowing to do this is to run the adverse impact study. Mm-hmm. Adverse impact is really looking at every possible issue that you can to see if you discriminate. It's even more than EEOC requires, because EEOC doesn't get all that specific as to, they put the protected group in a larger category. But an adverse impact study, you're actually looking at various nationalities. We're looking at veterans. We're looking at disabled veterans, all of those things. Are we discriminating against those people? Without that report, without numbers, and I have a lot of people say they don't discriminate, but they can't produce any numbers. Now, one of the challenges is that if your assessment is only used in training, age is one of the ways that we have to look at people to see if our assessment discriminates. And unless you're collecting age, you cannot. Now, age is another one of those things you can't ask as far as you are interviewing people.
Right.
But at TTI here 10, 12 years ago, I figured a way around that. And I built a site for people who were looking for jobs to come to my site, and I would find them jobs. I was not hiring them, so I could ask them certain things about age and stuff for research purposes. Mm-hmm. So I've been collecting information on people for the last 12, 14 years that allows me to do research quickly. And I also have done adverse impact studies within corporations, Fortune 100 companies, where I've gone in, we've run the assessment on all of their applicants, and then we ran the data for them and showed them that we not only don't discriminate against people, we don't discriminate against the people that are in your process, the people that are attracted to your company.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at every possible way. And again, I think this is critical. And I would always ask people, let me see your adverse impact study. I don't want nobody's opinion, especially a legal opinion or the in-house opinion, that you don't discriminate. If they don't have numbers, then you could be in trouble with the federal government.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to sort of share some statistics as well that we have been tracking. Large U.S. companies who use assessments as part of a hiring process, this is a growing demographic, as you can see. In 2001, 21%. In 2015, 57%. So assessments are being used, as you just mentioned, Bill, throughout large companies here and certainly abroad as well as part of that hiring process. It's a rising trend.
Yeah, and again, the reason for us doing this talk today is to say with this growing trend, what industry really deserves is the best from us.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and I don't consider any other assessment company that has integrity to be a competitor of mine. I consider that assessment companies with integrity should work together to build a bigger market for all of us.
Absolutely, and bring the standard practices
Yes.
up to
And we also
higher
should
level.
work together to eliminate these people who are not living up to our standards,
Absolutely.
because with this growth coming, they're going to kill the industry if we don't make for sure that people are valid.
Right. And so another statistic here, estimated companies who use assessments in general today, 65%. So if they're not using them for hiring, they may be using them for training and development purposes, for nurturing their future leadership, but they are being used in multiple ways inside of most large companies.
Yeah, now let me jump in and point out another thing. Many assessment companies out there come in and use their assessments to evaluate your superior performers, and then they put together a hiring model based on that. Well, I've got research to indicate that a strong brand can actually carry a weak sales force. And so when you're looking at your top salespeople in a strong brand company, I would classify many of them as C minus people. And so you start cloning somebody that's C minus, you wonder why it doesn't work. And I've got evidence to prove this, because in a Fortune 100 company, once I told them that, they listened to us and we benchmarked their job. In other words, TTI learned a long time ago that benchmarking top performers, it could be lukewarm. You need to benchmark the job, because if the job could talk, it would tell us who to hire.
Right.
Okay?
Exactly.
Job's not going to tell you to hire people that they don't want hanging around it. And so again, here, look at how they're making these claims, because as we grow here, we need to really make for sure that people are benchmarking the job, and then also make for sure that they're doing that right, because there's still sloppy ways of benchmarking jobs.
Absolutely. So it's predicted that U.S. companies who will use assessments in the next several years, that number will grow to 75%. So again, we are seeing growth in this industry, and we feel that we want to raise that bar. We want the assessment providers out there to be able to answer these questions, to be able to have integrity in what they're providing to companies. So these are impacting companies and people inside of them and their livelihood. So there's nothing that's more critical, nothing more important than the reliability and validity of the assessment that they're using.
And with the global economy, these companies also are starting to implement it worldwide.
Right.
And another thing I find that this, and I like this, we're finding that European countries are actually using American standards in their hiring process. The ramifications for a bad hire in Europe are much higher than they are here in the States. And so they've got more critical things, but they haven't had the standards raised over there, so they're looking at us for those standards.
Well, Bill, we do have a few questions here that have come up, so I would love to get your take on that. Someone is asking where our articles are being published. We have a list on our website of all our most recent publications, and we have been published. I think our most recent one was in Mind Body, as you had mentioned earlier. neuro counseling as well. So there is a list there, and we can post that link. This is great material for use with clients. We're glad you found it helpful. Again, we will be sending out the recording, and I've also, if you hadn't noticed, in the handout section are all the slides, so feel free to use those. Someone asking here, Bill, if what you've got in the pipeline.
Oh, my pipeline is always full on that. We'll never have an empty pipeline, but we're working on some research projects right now. One of the projects, we've got 10 high schools that we got a project going with this fall, and we will be writing up something. I don't know what it's going to be totally with that. I'm also revisiting my serial entrepreneur study and comparing the 6 motivators to go back and see if I can reconstruct and come out and look at 12 driving forces. And we've got some driving forces research going. We also have some skill research going. And we also are looking at connection between the brain and skills and trying to expand upon identifying skills that are easy for people to develop and skills that are hard for people to develop based on their brain. We're seeing there is something there, and at this point, it's internally the researchers talking about it, but we want more data before we're actually going to write it up.
Someone's asking too if you have any information on generational trends or the different differences between the generations and DISC and motivators, or if you're looking into that as an area of research.
Well, I read a lot about millennials and everything, and I always think, I look at everybody as unique, and you can't classify any group by what they're talking about in many of those articles, because I'm telling you, there's great people in every age group, and male, female, sex, you name it. I look at them as all positive, and those of you who've been around me, you'll say, we need to learn to love our differences as a way of dealing with this and valuing that. But I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of detail with that other than what I've just said about the differences.
So somebody had asked, what's the current percentage of U.S. companies using assessments? Again, in general, 65% according to the Wall Street Journal, and then specifically as part of a hiring process, currently about 57% using assessments. Here's another individual. Do you know of any peer-reviewed research articles that are using trimetrics as a measurement tool?
Yes. There was a peer-reviewed article on medical students that was done by Dr. Bell.
Correct, and we do have that on our website as well.
Okay.
We'll include, by the way, all the question and answers in our follow-up email.
What that study was about was looking at first-year medical students and predicting their scores 4 years later. And they found out they could predict within 1 to 5%. And the Hartman that was a major contributor to that prediction.
We also have a question here on the best process for job benchmarking. And maybe just explain briefly a little bit about what job benchmarking is for maybe some of our audience that is not familiar.
Okay. Well, to really identify and get into a job benchmark, I go through a process of defining key accountabilities. If you can't, I can't look at a job description and tell you what it takes to be successful in that job. But once you define key accountabilities and go through our process of prioritizing and assigning time and value to them, then I look at every key accountability by itself and say, what is the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, the skills, the behavior, the intrinsic motivator for that. So I really break a job down. And our whole process starts that way of defining that. And, you know, it's great when a new person starts and you hand them key accountabilities. They actually know what they're to do.
Right. And then they're also asking about comparing that benchmark to the report, to the TTI report. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and how?
Well, yeah, because see, we have the job system and then we got the people system, so we can actually compare apples and apples there. And we recommend, you know, comparing both the behavior, the motivators, the skills, and even the Hartman on the 6 And so we're constantly looking at refining. And then once I do a benchmark, and I have a benchmark, I also like to look at superior performers and maybe a group of people that maybe shouldn't have been hired. And I'm trying to refine what is the real deal breaker at this company. A lot of times you will learn more about it, but again, those are things that we've got videos on that. We talk about that. We have a process for that, and it's a critical process that any assessment user, if you're going to use it for selection, you need to talk to us about our benchmarking process.
Yes, all right. Bill, how can people respond when if they are using a TTI assessment and someone challenges that? What do you think is the best way, just in general, for them to respond to a challenge on the validity or liability?
Well, the bottom line is after you run the assessment and you read it, if you go through and cross out everything you think is not true of you, you'd be surprised that the face validity is there. Now, sometimes people get hung up on one thing, and in fact, I had a call this week about the report said intuitive, and they didn't have the graph. And I said, well, I can't respond without a graph. I have to see the graph because we are so specific in identifying things. The minute I saw the graph, here's where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. This is exactly, but this was a person didn't ever see that in themselves. You know, I got to tell you another story here. Most of you know me, I'm a storyteller, but I had a lady in here who was in her 60s, had a PhD, had been chief learning officer for a Fortune 100 company. And I looked at her report and I said, you know, you have an entrepreneurial mindset. She says, no one has ever told me that in my whole life. She said, I just left a corporation because I couldn't get them to follow my vision. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden it made sense for her, the challenge that she had. And it was her vision, it was her entrepreneurial mindset that allowed her to draw to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. And she was so upset that other people didn't see it. Mm-hmm. People with an entrepreneurial mindset, a lot of people don't understand because their visions are out front. Mm-hmm.
We had somebody asking some follow-up questions about research about generations. I think this is something that, you know, we'll continue to look at the data as we move forward and look for trends. And we always do, as you mentioned earlier, we do regular norming. We look at population shifts. And we can see demographically as well if things are shifting.
I would refer them to Lisa Aldiser.
Yes.
She did her dissertation on that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there was some things that the general population is talking about she somewhat disproved. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of myths out there that are not supported with scientific evidence.
Mm-hmm. But that's something that we'll continue, I'm sure, to look at. All right, so we had somebody ask a follow-up question about your earlier comment about entrepreneurial mindset. How do you define an entrepreneurial mindset?
I have to look at both their behavior and their motivators, and I also throw in some skills. Okay. But I'm looking at those three to find an entrepreneurial mindset. Mm-hmm. Entrepreneurs have personal accountability. That's a skill. Mm-hmm. Okay. They also have a mindset for utility and control. Mm-hmm. All right. And they're depending on age. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. The younger they are, D's and I's tend to be entrepreneurial younger than S's and C's, but S's and C's are somewhat age related. They become entrepreneurial minded later on when their economic conditions have been met. In other words, their security concerns are set aside. S's and C's can become entrepreneurial in their 40s and 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. That's important to note because everybody else is condemning them and not seeing that. Mm-hmm. But in their 20s, you're trying to force them.
Right.
They may not be ready for that unless you're covering their risk.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But it's your motivators. It's the way you see things. Mm-hmm. The visions you have don't come from behavior. Right. Your visions are actually going to come from your motivators. And you'll be happy to know I've been reading Types of Men again, and I think this maybe for the 8th time. Mm-hmm. And I'm not so certain I'm learning more now than I ever did in the first 7. It's amazing how all of a sudden all of these years of looking at this, and then you let it rest for a while, it's coming back.
Yeah. I would also point you to your recent blog post, Bill, about the top 5 skills of leaders.
Yes.
And it is on our blog. So if you go to ttisi.com and just go over to media and go to the blog, you'll see a list of those top 5 skills. And that was based off of research that you spoke about earlier that was published in the Harvard Business Review.
Yes.
As well. So I think that does it for all the questions we have time for today. We've hit our time. Just want to thank everyone again, and we'll be following up with our emails with a recording. One more question that just popped up. What you said about S and C becoming entrepreneurial later in life, can that be generalized as S's and C's being more inclined to be late bloomers?
I wouldn't tie that together, because you got to look at the motivators. The people, they're going to have utilitarian as a part of their mindset, along with the individualistic. But S's that are high in individualistic, you don't really see the control. They're not blatant with the control. It's more of a persistent, they don't quit. They're just, and so, people ask me why am I successful? And I said it was persistence or too dumb to quit. Both will work for you. Both will work.
There you have it, folks. Well, thank you once again, and we look forward to having you on our next webinar. And please visit ttisi.com to find more out about our company and our research and the reliability of our assessments. And have a wonderful day.